kontrol edin arkadaşlar. Emin olalım bağlandığımızda. Şu an bağlanmış olmamız lazım.
Yok, bağlanmadı.
Bende de gösteriyor.
Ben
Bağlandık.
Tamam.
Buyurun.
Tekrardan merhaba herkese. İkinci oturumumuza devam ediyoruz. Diane Sunar hocamız bize Moral Emotions adlı sunumunu aktaracak. Birkaç hatırlatma yapalım tekrar. Oturumun sonunda 10 dakika açık kalacak yoklama formları atılacak. 7'sini doldurana katılım sertifikamızı vereceğiz. Onun dışında günün sonunda bir testimiz olacak. Bu oturumların içerikleriyle alakalı hocalarımızın önerileriyle, soru önerileriyle oluşturduğumuz. Bunun dışında sorularınızı YouTube chatine buradan ulaştırabilirsiniz bize. Biz o sunumun sonunda aktaracağız hocamıza. Hocam isterseniz vakit kaybetmeden başlayabiliriz.
Başlayalım mı?
Tabii, olur. Buyurun.
Oldu. Merhaba, iyi günler herkese. Let me switch to English right away because our talk is going to be in English. I'm going to be talking about moral emotions and how they function. And towards the end, I'll be talking about a piece of research that I carried out with some colleagues, and we recently published it, and I'll give you the reference for that. But we're going to start with some theoretical ideas and then move down to a hypothesis and then move down to the test. And we'll do this with the help of slides. So let me start the Okay, can everybody see this? I hope.
Evet, görebiliyoruz.
So I'm starting with questions, actually. Moral emotions. What are they? When do we experience them? Why do we experience them? And so our first questions are, for example, which emotions are moral? Why do we call them moral? Why do we have them? To answer that, we need to talk about what functions these emotions have in regulating our motivations and behaviors. And turns out there's more than one moral emotion. And so we need to ask whether there's a relation, whether there are relationships among the different kinds of emotions. And then I'm going to be talking about at least a couple of theories that help us explain when and why we experience moral emotions. And one of them is called relational models theory. So we ask, how do those models affect the moral emotions? And just briefly, we might ask, how does a person's position in a hierarchy affect the moral emotions? Probably won't have time to talk about that very much, but we will have time to talk a little bit about how culture affects the moral emotions. So let's go back in history quite a bit to Darwin. So we're talking about, I don't know, 100 and how many years ago? 150 years ago almost. Darwin was very interested in human emotions, also emotions of animals. And he was convinced that emotions have evolved. Now, if they have evolved in a species, that would indicate that they would be basically similar throughout the species. Now, there are always individual differences in every species, but all humans according to this theory, should have similar emotions, and in fact, related animals should also have similar emotions. And one thing we know about emotions is that many of them are expressed. If you look at the pictures of these two young children, I think none of us have any trouble figuring out what these children were probably feeling at the moment that the pictures were taken, right? Emotions are expressed and understood in similar ways between individuals, just like you understand these babies. And it doesn't matter which culture they come from, you still understand basically what they are feeling. Now, after Darwin, not many people took a great interest in this question, but in the middle of the last century, the 20th century, Paul Ekman got interested in Darwin's observations about the similarity of facial expressions across individuals and cultures. And he identified 7 emotional expressions that are pretty easily recognized pretty much everywhere. Now, there are a lot of arguments about the details of and the meaning of Ekman's findings, but to a large extent, they stand even today, 50 years later, more than 50 years later. But these 7 emotions and their expression were anger. These are in alphabetical order: anger, contempt, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Now, you should always keep in mind when thinking about these that cultures also have display rules about expressing these emotions. So some of them, different cultures may forbid people to express or make rules about when or towards whom or how you can express them and so forth. So everybody who is feeling anger doesn't look the same way because they have some control over their own expressions. And individuals may also have some differences about how much they display their emotions and when, under what circumstances, and so forth. I've given references at the bottom of the slide. There was a huge study of 30-some cultures that's written up in the Matsumoto paper, and the Turkish part of it was done by Hale Bolatov and myself and Bilge Ataca back in the, now it's been more than 10 years since we did this, but there's information there about what are the Turkish rules for expressing emotions. But Ekman is not the only one who set out to look for so-called basic emotions, temel. Panksepp was a psychoanalytically oriented neuroscientist. So obviously he's coming from a very different place than social psychologist Ekman. And he also identified 7 basic emotions. They're not exactly the same. Some of them are the same. So the ones he identified were seeking and rage, which is similar to Ekman's anger, fear. Ekman also talked about fear. Panksepp talks about grief. Ekman talks about sadness. And then his other emotions, Panksepp's other emotions, are not on the list that Ekman came up with. Now, that's because the 2 guys were looking for really different definitions of basic. Ekman wanted to know what's basic in the sense that everybody recognizes it on other people's faces. Panksepp's theory was mostly derived from his work with animals, and so he was concerned about what are the functions of emotions because he thought they were not just feelings, but they were patterns of brain activation that motivate and regulate behavior, and that these are common to all mammals. So these two different ways of looking at basic emotions will be useful to us. Let's stick with Paxep for just a minute or two and talk about the functions of emotions. Different emotions have different functions, as you can imagine. In other words, sadness is not going to get you to do the same things that anger will or happiness will. So what they do, according to Paxep and other theorists, is that they help to direct our attention to certain aspects of the environment or our experience. They help to motivate our behaviors. They help to regulate our behaviors. To give a very, very simple example of this, everybody knows about fight or flight. You know, you're confronted with a danger. Do you run away from it, or do you fight against it? Anger will help us fight against it. Fear will help us run away from it, will motivate us to do these things. Now, emotional expression, which is what Ekman was worried about, expression also has a function. It communicates our state to other people. Okay, so that communication function is true of some emotions and not true of others. Some of your emotions may never show themselves on your face. Well, we need to think about why that's the case, which we will in a couple of minutes. Now, the title of the talk is Moral Emotions. And so we're going to focus on, a particular set of emotions. If emotions in general have special functions, then the moral emotions should also have special functions. And they do, or so we think. We think that the moral emotions help to promote cooperation and social harmony, that they help to motivate us to be good, to carry out good behavior that we like and approve of. And they also help to prevent damage or to repair damage to social relationships. So they motivate us to repair things that have gone wrong after we've done something bad. So, you feel guilty or you feel ashamed, and you go to the person you hurt and you say, I'm sorry. Or you try to make up for it in some way. But these emotions also motivate us to punish people who are behaving badly. So it's a whole set of both emotions and functions of these emotions. But which ones are they? I haven't defined those yet. Moral emotions are the emotions that signal our approval or disapproval. And they can be directed at the self, or they can be directed at others. And so I'm going to talk about self-blaming emotions and other blaming emotions. Now, most psychologists who have been interested in moral emotions up until recently have concentrated mostly on self-blaming emotions, feeling shame, feeling guilt, individual differences in who is more likely to feel shame and who's more likely to feel guilt, and what kinds of function that has in their mental health and so forth. I'm not going to go there today. I just want to say that these are emotions in which we judge ourselves. Both of them can be felt at the same time. And in my experience in talking with students is that most people don't even really disentangle them. They don't really feel that there's a big difference between utanç and suçluluk, if I can say it in Turkish, guilt and shame in English. On the other hand, the other blaming emotions are, well, they can also be mixed up with each other, but they're a little more distinct. One of them is anger. I call it kızgınlık, but they're other words for the same thing. And this emotion is directed against other people who are doing things that we think are bad or wrong, or against an unjust situation where we think it's not fair. Another one is contempt, küçük görme, mesela, disgust, iğrenme. Let's look at these in a little more detail, all of them actually. Now, is there a relation between the basic emotions that we talked about and the moral emotions? And there's this interesting fact, which is that 3 of Ekman's so-called basic emotions are other blaming moral emotions: anger, disgust, and contempt. But the self-blaming emotions are not in Ekman 7. So why do you think this may be the case? Well, this goes back to the communication value of expression. Ekman's basic emotions are about basically expression. So those emotions are the ones that communicate messages to others. So if we feel anger or disgust or contempt, in other words, we're really disapproving of something that somebody has done or is threatening to do or is in danger of doing, we want to get the message across that, no, that was a bad thing to do, or it is something that should not be done. So these basic, so-called basic emotions being easily communicated are about partly about the emotions that we need to show to other people to regulate their social behavior. Whereas the emotions we feel, the moral emotions we feel towards ourselves, don't necessarily need to be expressed to other people. So, well, when do we blame ourselves or others? Well, when we do something bad. Now, what does it mean to do something bad? And one way to understand this is to think about violations of ethical or moral codes. Now, some people think of this in terms of religious rules, or they think of it in terms of laws or whatever. But the idea of an ethical code or cultural ethic has a special definition that I'm going to talk about now. That's one way of looking at it. Another very similar way of looking at it is to say that when a relational model has been violated, then we're going to feel one of these self-blaming or other blaming emotions. And this is defined in terms of relational models theory, which was put forth by Alan Fisk. So let's look at the ethics or codes first, proposed by Rick Schrader. Schrader, with his colleagues, as you can see there, Mahapatra and Park, Schrader suggests that cultures have 3 different domains, you might say, ways of thinking about morality. Now, this means it's plural. It means that there's not just one code of ethics or one code of morality. There are three, and it depends on, in each culture, it depends on how much emphasis that culture gives to certain kinds of rights and responsibilities and duties. Schrader suggests that these three are community, which are the duties and responsibilities of rights with regard to authority and the community. For example, requirements for obedience and loyalty, protection and defense of the group, this kind of thing. And when people don't carry out those duties or they, go against these rules, then there's going to be a community violation. At the same time, in the same culture, actually, there's another set of rights and responsibilities, this time for the individual, that have to do with things like justice and freedom and security, and even freedom includes a lot of things, like being able to do what you want to do, having preferences and so forth. And so that autonomy realm or code or ethic can also be violated. The third one, and I think most people think of this as part of community, but Schrader sees it as quite different, something he calls divinity, or Jonathan Haidt calls it purity. These are the duties and responsibilities and rights with regard to religious rules. Well, not everybody is religious, or there are different religions and they have different rules, but they all have ideas of purity and pollution and perhaps holiness, these kinds of things. And so violations there are rather different from the ones that are directed towards community rights and responsibilities, autonomy rights and responsibilities. In fact, it's possible to match up the other blaming emotions that we talked about with the moral codes as they are outlined by Schrader and his colleagues. So contempt tends to be felt when we see people carrying out community violations. Anger when we see violations of autonomy. Disgust when we see violations of divinity rules. So this is called the CAD theory, because the first letters in English of these, both the ethics and the emotions can be matched up. That wouldn't work in Turkish, of course, as a CAD theory. We'd have to call it something else. Now, let me turn to the other related theory, which has 4 ways of people being together and having obligations towards one another. This is Alan Fiske's idea. He says that people are sometimes in a relational model, as he calls it, that he calls communal sharing. In this kind of relationship, you treat all the members of the group, including yourself, as equivalent with respect to some kind of resource or obligation or threat or almost anything. And within this kind of a group, people try to meet each other's needs, basically, and to take care of one another. But in authority ranking, there's a hierarchy. There's no hierarchy in communal sharing, although these models can go together sometimes. Hierarchical relationships that are perceived as legitimate, and they're characterized by respect for and loyalty to the authority, and authority taking care of the subordinates, This is a totally different way of being together socially, and it imposes different obligations on people than the communal sharing. Equality matching requires equal exchange, reciprocity, equal distribution, equal opportunities, equal punishments. It's a rule of fairness, essentially. And then there is market pricing, which focuses on proportionality. Now, when things are divided equally between people, people may disagree with that because they may say, but I did more work, but I'm more qualified. I should get more. So market pricing is not that kind of proportionality, whether you're talking about rewards or whether you're talking about punishments. The reason people get different amounts of time in jail is because we try to give punishments that are proportional to the crime that's been committed, for example. Now, I keep saying these are similar. Let me show you how, because the relational models correspond more or less to the moral codes or to the ethics. So the relational model and the moral code versus Schrader. It turns out the communal sharing goes pretty well with divinity. Now, communal sharing and divinity don't exactly fit, but communal sharing has to be in a closed group. You have to know who's a member and who's not. Okay, and divinity is all about rules that mark off membership in a group so that people who do certain things or don't do certain things belong, and the ones that don't follow those rules don't belong. So that's how I put them together. Authority ranking seems to line up pretty well with community, and the rights of fairness seem to go pretty well with autonomy. So why am I talking about all this kind of stuff? Because when we're going to say that there's a violation, in other words, doing something bad is equal to violating the rules of a relational model or an ethic, a social ethic. And I more or less talked about these things, but the failure to meet the needs of others, violation of the group rules, violations of the boundaries, violations of the taboos is one kind of bad behavior. Whereas authority ranking and community says that disobedience, going against authority, going against tradition, being disloyal, superiors not protecting their subordinates, people trying to overstep their boundaries of rank. These kinds of things are the sins, you might say, the bad behavior in that kind of construction. And equality matching and market pricing, I'm putting together here because they're both about different kinds of fairness. It's an unfair behavior we disapprove of. We disapprove of failure to reciprocate. So now we've defined what a violation is. And those are the things we disapprove of. And how do we react when we see somebody else violate a moral rule? We feel anger, we feel disgust, we feel contempt. But which one? It depends on the moral ethic or the relational model. Now let's look at some illustrations. Now, I'm showing you pictures because to remind you that Ekman was not wrong about facial expressions of emotion. We know what anger looks like. But where do we see anger? It's when we're disapproving in the autonomy moral code, or we're disapproving in the fairness related, that is equality matching, market pricing, relational models. Okay, we mentioned disgust. Okay, it's typical of disapproval in divinity or relational models with those kinds of constructions of our relationships. The violation of boundaries, basically. And then there's contempt. If somebody doesn't live up to their community obligations, they don't do their duty, they're not respectful of authority and tradition, we have contempt for them. Now, just as shame and guilt can be mixed, all of those can also be mixed. Now, this looks at the self-blaming emotions in terms of the same constructions, CS, ER, EMNP, or divinity, community, autonomy. What do we see in communal sharing? Anxiety about rejection, loss of closeness, exclusion from the group. We feel shame when we violate that kind of relationship. We feel shame also when we lose the respect of other people in a community violation or authority ranking violation. And we feel guilt. Those two kinds of shame, actually. One kind of guilt is when we think we have done harm and we want to make it up to the other person, then we feel guilt. And these often overlap. Actually, I will show you a graph later on that illustrates how extensively they overlap. But let's look at just the fact that they're so overlapping. I had trouble finding distinctive pictures. So shame, we often hide our face. Okay, so we have this guy hiding his face. It's defined as a painful emotion. But notice that even the dictionary says it's caused by a sense of guilt or embarrassment or unworthiness or disgrace. The opposite of shame is pride. I'm not talking about positive emotions today, but there is a positive side to all of these also. And we said that this is felt in violations of the divinity ethic or the communal sharing. What about guilt? Well, in guilt, the man doesn't completely cover his face, but he is not feeling good about what he has done. We can understand guilt better maybe by its opposite, which is in this case, innocence. So shame versus pride, guilt versus innocence. Now, is there a relation between the self-blaming and the other blaming emotions? My colleagues and I thought that there might be. And so we say, when there's a moral violation, the victim feels another blaming emotion. In other words, the person who gets harmed or otherwise is unhappy about the behavior, they feel an other blaming emotion. But the perpetrator, the one who's doing the bad thing, feels a self-blaming emotion. So can these two be connected? Is the question we set out to ask. And our hypothesis was that the moral emotions may be complementary or reciprocal. In other words, they may go together. So when the other blaming emotion is anger, the self-blaming emotion may be guilt. Same for disgust and shame. Same for contempt and shame. No. So we don't forget which relational model or which cultural ethic is being violated when there's anger or disgust or contempt. It's those same situations where we find guilt or shame. At least this is our hypothesis. So now the question is, can we test it? So here are some predictions that we were able to make, thinking through all these things. Number one, both the self-blaming emotions and the other blaming emotions will vary according to the relational model. Now, here I'm focusing on relational models because it's easier to turn these into experimental conditions than it is the cultural ethics. But as we saw earlier, they are pretty much parallel to one another anyway. So a second prediction is that disgust and shame will be more closely correlated in the communal sharing model than in any of the other models. So we're talking about correlation, basically. Correlation between disgust and shame will be higher in communal sharing than in the other relational models. Anger and guilt will be more closely correlated in the fairness models than in the other models. Contempt and shame will be more closely correlated in authority ranking. And these patterns, we suggest, will be similar across cultures. Now let's see how well these hypotheses do when we actually test them in an empirical way. We carried out 3 studies. And these are written up in the references given at the bottom of the slide. Along with me, there's Sevin Cesur, Ecem Piyale, Beyza Tepe, Ali Biten from the United States, Chuck Hill. He was studying in England at the time, Yasin Koch. And we wrote it up with the title, People Respond with Different Moral Emotions to Violations in Different Relational Models. A cross-cultural comparison. So this was published early last year in Emotion. Now, what did these studies do? First, we said, what do people feel who observe a moral violation? Now, of course, we couldn't arrange for people to go around doing bad things and be observed. So we wrote vignettes, which would fit into the different kinds of relational models. We had people read them, and then we asked them how much did they feel each of many different kinds of emotions, and then we looked at the moral emotions. In the second study, we wanted to look at the correlation between the other blaming emotions that people would expect in the victim and the self-blaming emotions that they would expect in the perpetrator in similar vignettes. And in the third study, we said, okay, let's look at that again, but in cross-cultural terms. Is there a difference between the cultures? So in the first study, what did we find? We found that the intensity of all three of the other blaming emotions correlated significantly with judgments of moral wrongness. So we asked people how morally wrong was this behavior, and the more wrong it was, the stronger their emotion was, the other blaming emotions. Now, it turned out that anger was experienced most strongly of all of them, and that was followed by disgust and then by contempt. But we also found that the different relational models had different patterns of emotion. And whether or not you were the leader or the follower in an AR model, the hierarchical model, that produced very different responses. And we hadn't expected that. So essentially, in this first study, we just found that, yes, people feel these particular emotions when they observe something done that's wrong, and it makes a difference which relational model it happens in. In the second study, we wanted to compare victims and perpetrators so that we could look at both self-blaming and other blaming emotions, and then look at that across the relational models so that we could see whether the complementary emotions hypothesis got any support or not. So these hypotheses again were that the link between victim disgust and perpetrator shame will be stronger in communal sharing than in the other relational models, that the link between victim contempt and perpetrator shame will be stronger in authority ranking than in the other relational models, and that the link between victim anger and perpetrator guilt will be stronger in equality matching and market pricing than in the other relational models. So let's see how our hypotheses fared here. The hypothesis about disgust and shame was supported. It was stronger in communal sharing than in any of the other relational models. But our predictions about authority ranking simply were not supported. We have to do some more work on authority ranking. I don't think anybody quite understands how right and wrong work in that relational model. In equality matching, the link between anger and guilt was stronger than the other links in equality matching, but it wasn't necessarily stronger than in the other relational models, which was interesting, but it didn't quite support our hypothesis. In this study, we found that shame was stronger than guilt. Now, it's frequently said that Turkish culture is a shame culture rather than a guilt culture. So we thought, is that because we did this in Turkey, or is it because that's the way it is everywhere? So we decided we needed to do a cross-cultural study. I'm not going to try to deal with the authority ranking because it's very interesting, but I don't have great answers about it. Okay, here's some of the graphics of the results. You can see that the anger, guilt, which is the purple bar, is higher in equality matching than it is wait a minute, I mixed myself up. Equality matching, yes, it's higher in equality matching than it is in any of the other possible places, and that's not very striking, but here's our shame and guilt. They go together perfectly. They vary. There's some shame and guilt in CS. There's the most in the subordinate position in AR. There's the least in the dominant position, and so forth. So they follow each other in a perfect pattern and almost at the same level in this second study. But now, when we did it in both the United States and in, I was going to say in the United States, but that's not entirely true because we mixed a United Kingdom and a United States set of people, English speaking. Both of those countries are thought to be guilt cultures. They're thought to be highly individualistic cultures, as opposed to Turkey, which is thought to be a somewhat collectivistic and shame-oriented culture. So we thought that would make a good comparison. And the result is quite similar to the second study and very similar across the cultures, but there were some differences in the details, as we can see here. Once again, we see that anger is the most common and the strongest felt emotion, followed by disgust, followed by contempt. And these are some more details about the relations among these things, but what are our conclusions? First of all, that relational models definitely influence the moral emotions. The other blaming and the self-blaming emotions are related under some conditions, particularly in communal sharing, where disgust and shame go together, and in equality matching, where anger and guilt tend to go together. The patterns of moral emotions are similar across two different cultures, but the intensity of the emotions is not the same. For example, with anger, Turkish subjects, participants felt more anger than the English-speaking participants, but there was more contempt in the English-speaking participants than in the Turkish participants. Now, the upshot of this is, with regard to authority ranking, is that we need to study the effects of power in more detail, because when the perpetrator is dominant, they don't feel very much emotion, and neither does the victim. Very interesting. When I say not much emotion, I mean not much moral emotion. When the perpetrator is subordinate, there's very strong blaming by the powerful side, mostly anger, and very strong shame and guilt in the subordinate. Now, when it comes to market pricing, there's hierarchy in that. And so in some ways, it's more like equality matching, and sometimes it's more like authority ranking. And we need to work on that problem as well. So this is the end of my talk. This is a list of relevant references that I put forth, and this is an example of the scenarios. And if anybody wants to see these, I'll be happy to send them. But if there are questions, I'd be happy to take the questions.
Thank you for great presentation. There are some questions. You let me ask you.
Okay.
You answered some of them, but we want to ask anyways. So this goes as in a linear fashion. Autonomy should develop then, so we can develop the moral codes and the divinity. Or do they affect each other all the same time, like in the ecological systems model?
What Schrader suggests is that all three of these ethics coexist in all cultures, but that the weight that's given to them may be different from one culture to another. So, for example, he's an anthropologist who has worked a lot in different areas of India. And in some areas of India, divinity, what he calls divinity, is so much stronger than anything else. It seems to, really establish most of the rules. But still, people have ideas of their individual rights, and they also have ideas about their obligations to the community and duty and so forth. Whereas if you look at, let's compare the very individualistic Americans with the Indians, they put tremendous emphasis on autonomy, on individual rights, on equality and those kinds of things. Whereas, but they also have authority and tradition, community obligations. They also have divinity problems. And if you look at their politics today, it's not divinity exactly, it's political allegiances, but it's functioning just like divinity because breaking the rules of what you can say or what positions you can prefer and so forth are very much defining of what kinds of people you can even associate with. It's very interesting. But the point is that actually the same research group that I named for this study that I explained, we also did a study of Turkish conceptions of morality. And the community would seem to be the most basic ethic that rules in Turkish culture. But of course, there is divinity and autonomy as well. So they don't precede or develop out of each other. They're coexistent.
Next question is, my opinion, all the emotions come from anger. For example, when we see something incomprehensible, we scare, but actually we being angry for that. Or why we laughing?
I think this person is trying to say we have multiple reactions to the same stimulus, or maybe different people might react differently to. But that's certainly true, because one person may interpret something as a threat, but the other person defines it as something that can be resisted. I mean, emotions like anger versus fear depend very much on how the person assesses the threat.
And the person who asked this question says that we are always in competition. Isn't the happiness of being so successful in this competition actually a bad thing? Are there articles written similar to my thoughts?
Yes, there's always competition, and people are usually happy when they win. Yes. If there is too much emphasis on competition, that's not good for social relations. And so humans usually need more than one kind of relationship with one another. That's why there's these different kinds of relational models, we might say. Sometimes it's not individuals that are competing with one another, but groups that are competing with one another. If your group is competing with another group, you're likely to be very cooperative with your group. But then maybe you want to be the leader of your group also. These things work together. They're all human, and you can't eliminate any of them. The only thing you can do is bring them into balance.
Next question is, how did you measure emotions like shame during your study?
We just asked people. I mean, we told a little story about somebody who violated a rule, okay? And then we said, so there are two people. Let's say Hassan treats Mehmet unfairly. So you say, how much will Hassan feel guilty? How much will Mehmet feel angry? But we asked all of the emotions for both people and to all of the participants. So all the tremendous number of numbers in this.
Someone said I got curious about its relation to narcissism.
Narcissism. This theory, this set of theories that I've been talking about, is not very much about differences among individuals. It's more about general patterns of human behavior. But you could probably say that narcissism is the, among other things, inability to get into deep social relations with other people, with the exception maybe of hierarchical relations. So to have a full and happy and productive human life, you need to have all these different kinds of relationships. You need to be close with people. You need to be responsible. You need to be fair. You need to look for your own rights. You need to succeed, but you also need to be helpful. And narcissists are not able to do most of that.
The last question is, you stated a direct effect between the factors, but correlation does not mean causation. So what if do say the same research with an experimental design? How would it be, or a qualitative design?
Well, actually, it was an experiment because people were randomly assigned in the third study. They were randomly assigned such that the only things they read about were one of the relational models. Okay. Now, yes, then we looked at the correlations within the experimental condition. So we looked at the relation between anger and guilt, or between anger and shame, or whatever. But we were not arguing that anger causes guilt. We were arguing that violation of the equality matching relational model leads to anger in the victim and guilt in the perpetrator. So it's not that either one of them causes the other, but that they go together because they're happening in that relational model. And we tested the relational models as randomly assigned conditions.
Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for listening.
I'm switching to Turkish. Yarım saat sonra diğer oturumumuz başlayacak. Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşmek üzere. İyi günler.
Sonlandırabiliriz yani.